Have you ever been so desperate that you'd knock on the devil's door at midnight? Because that's exactly what 22-year-old Catalina Herrera found herself doing on a cold Tuesday night in Guadalajara, her heart hammering against her ribs as she approached the most feared compound in the city. The wrought iron gates loomed 12 feet high, topped with razor wire that glinted menacingly under the security floodlights. Two guards flanked the entrance, their assault rifles held with casual familiarity that spoke of years in this deadly business. Catalina's hands trembled as she clutched the piece of paper with Diego Morales' address, the ink smudged from her sweaty palms during the 30-minute walk through the city's most dangerous neighborhood. 3 days earlier, Catalina had been living a different kind of desperation, working double shifts at the textile factory during the day and cleaning office buildings at night. She barely scraped together enough money to keep food on the table and pay rent for the tiny apartment she shared with her 16-year-old sister Isabella. Their parents had been killed in a car accident when Isabella was only 10, leaving Catalina to raise her alone with nothing but determination and love. Isabella was supposed to be home from school by 4 o'clock that Tuesday. When 6 o'clock came and went with no sign of her sister, Catalina felt the familiar knot of worry tighten in her stomach. When 8 o'clock arrived and Isabella still hadn't returned or answered her phone, worry transformed into panic. By 10 o'clock, when Catalina had called every friend, checked every usual hangout, and even gone to the police station only to be told they couldn't file a missing person report for 24 hours, panic became something else entirely. The phone call came at 11:15. Isabella's voice was small and terrified. "Mama Cat," she whispered, using the childhood nickname she hadn't used in years. "They took me. They say you have to give them 50,000 pesos or they'll kill me. They said if you call the police, they'll know, and I'll disappear forever." 50,000 pesos might as well have been 50 million. Catalina made 800 pesos a week when she was lucky enough to get overtime at both jobs. Even if she stopped eating entirely and lived on the street, it would take her more than a year to save that much money. The man on the phone had given her 72 hours. That's how Catalina found herself standing outside the compound of Diego Morales, the most powerful cartel leader in western Mexico, with nothing but courage born of desperation and the clothes on her back. "I need to see Diego Morales," she told the first guard, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the terror coursing through her veins. The guard, a stocky man with neck tattoos and cold eyes, looked her up and down with obvious amusement. "You lost, little girl? This isn't a place for someone like you." "Someone like me," Catalina repeated, lifting her chin despite the way her knees wanted to buckle. "You mean someone who works for a living? Someone who doesn't hurt innocent people for money?" The second guard, taller and leaner but with the same dead expression, stepped closer. "You need to leave. Now, before you say something that gets you hurt." But Catalina had come too far to turn back now. Isabella was counting on her, and she was the only family her sister had left in the world. "Please," she said, and hated how the words sounded like begging. "My sister was taken by Los Serpientes. I need Diego Morales' help. I'll do whatever he wants, give him whatever he asks for. I just need my sister back." Something shifted in the guard's expressions. The stocky one spoke into his radio in rapid Spanish, then listened to the response. After a long moment, he gestured toward the gate. "El Jeef wants to see what kind of woman walks into a lion's den at midnight." The compound was larger than Catalina had expected, with manicured gardens and fountains that seemed absurdly peaceful given the violence that emanated from this place. The main house was a sprawling hacienda-style mansion, all warm adobe and wrought iron balconies, beautiful enough to grace the cover of an architecture magazine, if not for the armed men positioned at every corner. They led her through a heavy wooden door into an entrance hall with soaring ceilings and expensive tile work. Everything spoke of wealth beyond anything Catalina had ever imagined, the kind of money that came from controlling an empire built on fear and blood. "Wait here," the tall guard instructed, positioning himself by the door while his partner disappeared deeper into the house. Catalina stood in the center of the hall, her worn sneakers silent on the polished floor, and tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. She'd heard the stories about Diego Morales. They said he was ruthless, that he'd killed his first man at 17 and had been building his empire ever since. They said he showed no mercy to enemies and little kindness to friends. They said he was brilliant and dangerous and utterly without conscience. They also said he was the only man in Guadalajara powerful enough to make Los Serpientes return what they'd stolen. Footsteps echoed from the hallway beyond, slow and measured, each one making Catalina's pulse jump a little higher. She smoothed her hands over her faded jeans and straightened her shoulders, determined to meet her fate with whatever dignity she could muster. The man who emerged from the shadows was not what she'd been expecting. Diego Morales was tall, probably 6 feet and change, with broad shoulders that filled out his expensive black shirt in a way that spoke of disciplined strength rather than bulk. His face was angular and aristocratic, olive skin unmarked by the violence of his profession, dark hair styled with the kind of casual perfection that cost more than Catalina made in a month. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath entirely. They were the color of aged whiskey, amber and gold and burning with an intelligence that seemed to see straight through to her soul. He looked younger than she'd expected, probably mid-30s, and devastatingly handsome in the way of men who had never doubted their own power. This was not the scarred monster of street rumors. This was a man who could have graced magazine covers or boardrooms, who wore his dangerous reputation like expensive cologne, subtle but unmistakably present. "So," he said, and his voice was like aged rum, smooth and warm with an undertone that promised fire. "You're the woman brave enough or foolish enough to knock on my door at midnight." Catalina found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. "My name is Catalina Herrera. Los Serpientes took my sister Isabella 3 days ago. They want 50,000 pesos for her return." Diego moved closer, each step deliberate and predatory in a way that made every instinct scream at her to run. But Catalina held her ground, meeting his gaze even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I don't have 50,000 pesos, she continued. "I work 2 jobs and barely make enough to keep us fed and housed. But I'll do anything, give you anything, if you'll help me get her back." Anything is a dangerous word, especially in a place like this. Diego stopped just close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her unexpectedly aware of her own femininity. "What makes you think I care about the problems of someone like you?" The question stung, but Catalina had expected it. "Because you're the only one powerful enough to help, and because even men like you must understand what it means to protect family." Something flickered in Diego's expression at her words, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Men like me," he repeated softly, and there was a threat of danger in his tone that made the guard by the door shift nervously. "Yes," Catalina said, surprised by her own boldness. "Men who built their power on fear and violence. Men who take what they want and destroy what stands in their way. But also men who understand that family is everything, because family is the only thing worth protecting in this world." The silence stretched between them, heavy with tension and possibility. Diego's whiskey eyes never left hers, and Catalina felt exposed under that intense scrutiny, as if he could read every desperate thought in her head. Finally, he spoke. "You have courage, Catalina Herrera. Foolish courage, perhaps, but courage nonetheless. That's rare in my experience." "Is that enough?" she asked, and hated how much hope had crept into her voice. "Is that enough to make you help me?" Diego was quiet for another long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin warm despite her terror. Then he turned to the guard by the door. "Prepare one of the guest rooms," he said. "Miss Herrera will be staying with us while we discuss the details of her proposal." Relief flooded through Catalina so powerfully that her knees actually wobbled. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you so much." But Diego's next words sent a chill down her spine. "Don't thank me yet," he said quietly. "You came here asking for help from the devil, and devils always demand payment. You might not like the price I require." As the guard led her toward the stairs, Catalina cast one last look over her shoulder at Diego Morales. He stood watching her go, his expression unreadable, and she wondered if she'd just made a bargain that would save her sister's life or damn them both. But with Isabella's terrified voice still echoing in her memory, Catalina knew she'd make the same choice again. Some things were worth any price, even dealing with the devil himself. The guest room was more luxurious than anywhere Catalina had ever slept, with a king-sized bed draped in expensive linens and a private bathroom larger than the kitchen in her apartment. She sat on the edge of the mattress, still wearing her clothes from the factory, afraid to touch anything that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. Sleep had been impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Isabella's terrified face and heard that trembling voice calling her Mama Cat. Somewhere across the city, her sister was being held by men who had already proven their willingness to destroy innocent lives for money. Catalina pressed her hands against her eyes, trying to push away the images of what they might be doing to a 16-year-old girl. A soft knock interrupted her spiral of worry. "Come in," she called, expecting one of Diego's guards. Instead, Diego himself entered carrying a tray that smelled like heaven. He'd changed from his expensive black shirt into jeans and a white button-down that was somehow even more attractive in its casual elegance. Without his intimidating formal wear, he looked younger, more approachable, though no less dangerous. "You haven't eaten," he observed, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "Maria prepared something for you." Catalina's stomach betrayed her with a loud growl at the scent of fresh tortillas and seasoned meat. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a real meal, having been too worried about Isabella to think about food. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." Diego pulled out the chair for her, a gesture so unexpectedly courteous that she blinked in surprise. Everyone needs to eat, especially someone who's been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. As Catalina sat down to the most delicious meal she'd tasted in years, Diego settled into the chair across from her. "Tell me about Isabella," he said. "How long have you been raising her alone?" Between bites of perfectly seasoned carnitas, Catalina found herself sharing more than she'd intended. Her parents had died when she was 18 and Isabella was 10, leaving them with nothing but each other and a mountain of medical debt from her father's cancer treatment. Catalina had dropped out of university to work full-time, taking whatever jobs she could find to keep them afloat. "She works hard in school," Catalina said, unable to keep the pride out of her voice. "Straight A's and everything. She wants to be a doctor. Says she's going to take care of people the way the hospital couldn't take care of Papa. She's so smart, so good. She doesn't deserve this." "No child deserves this," Diego agreed, and something in his tone made Catalina look up from her food. His expression had grown distant, as if he was seeing something far beyond the walls of this room. "Do you have children?" she asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." Diego was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that suggested old pain. "No children," he said finally, "but I had a sister once. Younger than me, full of life and dreams. She used to say she wanted to be a teacher, help kids learn to read." The past tense wasn't lost on Catalina, nor was the careful control in Diego's voice. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It was a long time ago," Diego said, but his eyes remained shadowed. She would have been about Isabella's age when it happened. Catalina wanted to ask more, to understand what had shaped this complex man who showed kindness one moment and commanded an empire of violence the next. But something in Diego's expression warned her away from pushing too hard too soon. Instead, she finished her meal in comfortable silence while Diego made quiet phone calls in rapid Spanish. She caught enough words to understand he was having Isabella's disappearance investigated, calling in favors and resources that would have been impossible for her to access alone. When he finished the last call, Diego turned back to her. "Los Serpientes confirmed the kidnapping," he said. "My sources say they're holding her in a warehouse on the east side of the city. They're using her to get to you because they think you have information they want." Catalina frowned. "Information? I work in a textile factory and clean offices. What information could I possibly have?" Diego leaned forward, his amber eyes intense. "Where do you clean offices?" "The industrial complex on Avenida Revolution," Catalina replied. "Mostly accounting firms and small businesses." "Why?" "Because one of those businesses is a front for money laundering operations that Los Serpientes have been trying to infiltrate for months. They think you've seen something, overheard something, found something that could give them access." The realization hit Catalina like a physical blow. "This is my fault," she breathed. "Isabella was taken because of my job, because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time." "No," Diego said firmly, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. This is their fault for targeting innocent people. You're not responsible for the choices of criminals. His touch sent unexpected warmth up her arm, and Catalina found herself really looking at him for the first time since he'd entered the room. Diego Morales was undeniably handsome, but it was more than that. There was an intensity to him, a barely controlled energy that made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear. She'd noticed his hands earlier, but now she really studied them. They were strong and well-maintained, with long fingers that could probably span her entire wrist. No visible scars or calluses that would suggest he did his own violence anymore, though she didn't doubt he was capable of it. These were hands that commanded rather than carried out orders now. "I need some air," Diego said abruptly, dropping his hand from hers as if he'd felt the same electric awareness she had. "Would you like to see the gardens?" Outside, the compound looked different in daylight. The gardens were genuinely beautiful, with flowering trees and carefully maintained paths that spoke of someone who appreciated natural beauty. It seemed incongruous that such a peaceful place existed within the domain of organized crime. As they walked, 3 German shepherds bounded up to Diego with obvious affection. He knelt to greet them, his stern features softening as he scratched behind their ears and accepted enthusiastic licks. The transformation was remarkable, turning him from a feared cartel leader into someone who looked almost boyish in his genuine pleasure at the dog's attention. "They're beautiful," Catalina said, kneeling beside him to pet the nearest shepherd. "What are their names?" "This is Fuego," Diego said, indicating the largest male. "The female is Luna, and the youngest is Sombra. They were rescued from dogfighting rings. People think that makes them vicious, but they just needed someone to show them kindness." Catalina watched as Sombra nuzzled against Diego's chest, seeking affection with the desperate eagerness of an animal that remembered being unloved. It struck her that Diego might understand that feeling better than most people realized. "You saved them," she observed. "They saved me," Diego corrected quietly. Sometimes caring for something innocent reminds you that there's still good in the world worth protecting. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Catalina found herself studying Diego's profile as he continued petting the dogs, seeing past the expensive clothes and dangerous reputation to something vulnerable underneath. He was a man who'd built walls around himself for survival, but cracks were showing through which glimpses of his true nature escaped. "I'll get your sister back," Diego said suddenly, rising to his full height and fixing her with that intense golden gaze. "Los Serpientes made a mistake when they took her. They're about to learn that some things are sacred, even in this business." "Why?" Catalina asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why are you helping me? What do you get out of this?" Diego was quiet for so long that Catalina thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than she'd heard it before. "Maybe I'm tired of being the monster everyone thinks I am. Maybe I want to remember what it feels like to be someone's hero instead of their nightmare." The honesty in his admission took her breath away. This wasn't the cold cartel leader from last night. This was a man who'd been shaped by loss and violence, but hadn't let it destroy his capacity for compassion entirely. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it in ways that went far beyond gratitude for his help with Isabella. Diego stepped closer, close enough that she could see flecks of green in his amber eyes, close enough to catch that expensive cologne that made her unexpectedly aware of her own femininity. "Don't thank me yet," he said softly. "The rescue happens tomorrow night, and after that, nothing will be the same for any of us." As he led her back toward the house, Catalina wondered what he meant by those last words. But with Isabella's life hanging in the balance, she pushed her questions aside and focused on the hope blooming in her chest. For the first time in 3 days, she believed her sister might actually come home. Tomorrow night couldn't come soon enough. The warehouse on the east side of Guadalajara looked abandoned from the outside, its corrugated metal walls rusted and covered with graffiti. But Diego's intelligence had been accurate. Through night vision scopes, his team counted 6 guards stationed around the perimeter, their positions revealing this was far from an empty building. Diego crouched behind a shipping container, his black tactical gear making him nearly invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. He'd left Catalina at the compound under heavy guard, ignoring her pleas to come along. This was his world, his expertise, and he wouldn't risk her safety on a rescue mission that could turn deadly in seconds. The assault was swift and precise. Diego's men moved like shadows, neutralizing the perimeter guards with silent efficiency born of years in this brutal business. Within 10 minutes, they'd breached the warehouse and located Isabella in a back room, zip-tied to a chair, but otherwise unharmed. She was smaller than Diego had expected, with the same dark hair as her sister and enormous brown eyes that held too much fear for someone who should still be worried about homework and boys. When she saw Diego's men approaching, she pressed herself back against the chair, clearly terrified that her situation was about to get worse. "Isabella Herrera," Diego said quietly, kneeling in front of her chair while his men secured the building. "Your sister Catalina sent me to bring you home." The transformation in Isabella's face was immediate. Her eyes filled with tears of relief as Diego cut through the zip ties with quick, careful movements. "Is she okay?" Isabella whispered. "They said they would hurt her if I tried to escape." "She's safe," Diego assured her, helping her stand on shaking legs. "She's been worried sick about you, but she's safe at my home waiting for you to come back to her." The reunion at the compound 20 minutes later was everything Diego had hoped to see. Catalina flew down the front steps before his car had fully stopped, pulling Isabella into her arms with a sob of pure relief that made Diego's chest tighten unexpectedly. The sisters held each other tightly, both crying and talking at once, and Diego found himself looking away from their intimate moment. He'd forgotten what family love looked like, forgotten what it meant to have someone whose safety mattered more than your own life. Watching Catalina stroke Isabella's hair and whisper reassurances reminded him of feelings he'd buried so deep he'd convinced himself they no longer existed. "Thank you," Catalina said later, after Isabella had been fed and checked by Diego's personal physician and was finally sleeping safely in the room next to her sisters. "Thank you for bringing her back to me." They were standing in the garden where they'd walked yesterday, the same spot where Diego had felt the first crack in the walls he'd built around himself. But now those cracks felt wider, more dangerous. Catalina was looking at him with such gratitude, such trust, that it made him feel simultaneously protective and terrified. "You don't need to thank me," he said, but the words came out rougher than he'd intended. No child should be used as a pawn in games like this. Catalina stepped closer, close enough that he could see the exhaustion and relief warring in her dark eyes. "But you could have said no," she said softly. "You could have turned me away last night, and none of this would be your problem. Why didn't you?" The honest answer was too dangerous to speak aloud. Because something about her courage and desperation had called to parts of himself he'd thought were dead. Because she'd reminded him what it felt like to want to protect something precious. Because she looked at him like he might be a hero instead of a monster, and he'd forgotten how much he'd once wanted to be worthy of that kind of faith. Instead, Diego said, because Los Serpientes needed to learn that some lines can't be crossed. Catalina studied his face for a long moment, and Diego had the uncomfortable sensation that she could see right through his careful deflection to the truth underneath. Then she reached out and touched his arm, just a light brush of her fingers against his sleeve, but it sent heat racing through his entire body. "I know there's more to it than that," she said quietly. "I see how you are with your dogs, with Isabella, with your staff. You're not the monster you pretend to be, Diego Morales." Before he could respond to that dangerous observation, she rose on her toes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered against his skin. "For everything." The touch of her lips against his face lasted only seconds, but it left Diego feeling like he'd been struck by lightning. The scent of her hair, something light and floral despite everything she'd been through, filled his senses and made him want to turn his head just slightly to capture her mouth with his own. Instead, he stepped back, putting safe distance between them before he did something that would change everything irrevocably. Over the following days, a routine developed that felt more natural than Diego had expected. The sisters stayed in their adjoining rooms, but they quickly integrated into the daily life of the compound. Isabella, once she'd recovered from her ordeal, proved to be bright and curious, asking Diego endless questions about his gardens and dogs while Catalina watched with obvious affection. It was Catalina herself who presented the real challenge to Diego's carefully maintained control. She insisted on helping around the compound despite his protests that she was a guest, not a servant. He found her in the kitchen with Maria, learning to prepare his favorite dishes with an intensity that suggested she genuinely wanted to understand what pleased him. She joined him for coffee in the mornings, their conversations ranging from books to current events to childhood memories. And Diego discovered she was not only beautiful but intelligent and surprisingly well-read for someone who'd had to leave university. Most dangerously of all, she'd begun teaching herself about security protocols by observing his men and asking thoughtful questions about their procedures. Diego caught himself explaining defensive positions and escape routes to her, drawn in by her genuine interest and quick understanding. "You're planning to stay in this world, aren't you?" Isabella observed one afternoon while she helped Diego tend to his rose garden. She'd been quiet since the kidnapping, but was gradually returning to her normal teenage directness. "What makes you say that?" Diego asked, though he suspected he knew where this conversation was heading. "The way my sister looks at you," Isabella replied, deadheading spent blooms with careful precision. "And the way you look at her when you think no one's watching. She's never looked at anyone the way she looks at you. Your sister has been through trauma," Diego said carefully. "Gratitude isn't the same thing as affection." Isabella snorted, a sound that reminded him she was still essentially a child despite everything she'd endured. "I've lived with Catalina for 6 years since our parents died. I know the difference between her grateful face and her interestedinum face. This is definitely her interestedinum face." Before Diego could figure out how to respond to that mortifying observation, Catalina herself appeared on the garden path, carrying a pitcher of fresh lemonade. She'd been spending time in the sun, and her skin had acquired a light golden tone that made Diego's mouth go dry. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was wearing one of the sundresses Maria had procured for her, something yellow that made her look young and carefree despite everything she'd been through. "Plotting against me?" she asked lightly, but Diego caught the curious look she gave him when she noticed his heightened attention. "Just discussing your excellent taste in protectors," Isabella replied with the kind of mischievous grin that suggested she'd inherited the family gift for courage. "I was telling Diego that you've never brought a man home before, so he must be pretty special." "Isabella," Catalina protested, her cheeks flushing pink in a way that made Diego want to discover what other things might make her blush. "What?" Isabella continued with teenage ruthlessness. "It's true. You always said you were too busy taking care of me to date anyone. But then you walk into Cartel leader's compound at midnight for my sake. Seems like you finally found someone worth the risk." Diego should have redirected the conversation, should have made it clear that whatever was developing between him and Catalina was temporary and dangerous. Instead, he found himself watching Catalina's face, cataloging the way her breathing had quickened and how she couldn't quite meet his eyes. The moment was interrupted by the sharp ring of Diego's phone. The call was brief but disturbing. Los Serpientes had retaliated by firebombing 2 of his legitimate restaurants, injuring several employees and destroying months of careful work to build legal businesses alongside his illegal enterprises. "I have to go," Diego told the sisters after ending the call. "There's been an incident. Stay in the compound and don't leave for any reason." "Is it because of us?" Catalina asked, fear creeping back into her voice. "Because you helped Isabella?" Diego's first instinct was to lie, to protect her from the knowledge that their presence in his life had indeed escalated an already dangerous situation. But something about the trust in her eyes made him tell the truth instead. "Partly," he admitted. "But this war was coming regardless. Los Serpientes have been pushing into my territory for months. What happened with Isabella just gave them an excuse to move faster." Catalina bit her lower lip, a gesture that drew Diego's attention to her mouth in ways that were distinctly unhelpful given the circumstances. "Will you be safe?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. When was the last time someone had worried about his safety instead of what his death might mean for their own security? "I'll be careful," he promised, and meant it in ways that went beyond professional necessity. As Diego prepared to leave for what would likely be a long and violent night, he caught sight of Catalina watching him from an upstairs window. The concern in her expression sent warmth through his chest that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with the dangerous possibility that someone might actually care whether he came home alive. The war with Los Serpientes was escalating, and Diego knew the coming days would test everything he'd built. But looking up at Catalina's worried face, he realized he now had something worth fighting for beyond territory and pride. He had something worth surviving for. The attack came at 3 in the morning, shattering the peaceful quiet of the compound with the sound of automatic gunfire and shouting voices. Catalina jerked awake in her luxurious guest room, her heart hammering as she tried to process what was happening. Through her window, she could see muzzle flashes in the darkness and shadowy figures moving across the gardens where she and Diego had walked just hours before. Isabella's terrified scream from the next room galvanized Catalina into action. She ran to her sister's side, finding the 16-year-old huddled under her covers, shaking with the kind of fear that came from too recent trauma. "It's okay," Catalina whispered, pulling Isabella into her arms even as her own hands trembled. "Diego's men will handle this. We're safe here." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, Catalina's mind was racing with horrible possibilities. What if Los Serpientes had come for revenge? What if they'd brought enough men to overwhelm Diego's defenses? What if this luxurious compound became their tomb instead of their sanctuary? The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence that was somehow worse than the violence. Catalina strained to hear voices, footsteps, anything that might tell her whether Diego's men had been victorious or if Los Serpientes were now moving through the house hunting for targets. When Diego's voice came through the intercom system, Catalina nearly sobbed with relief. "All clear," he announced. "Perimeter is secure. Everyone remain in your rooms until further notice." But as the minutes stretched into an hour with no additional information, Catalina's relief transformed into a different kind of worry. Diego had been out there during the attack, probably in the thick of the fighting. Was he hurt? Was he dealing with casualties among his men? The not knowing was eating her alive. Isabella had finally fallen back asleep, emotionally exhausted by the terror of reliving her kidnapping experience. But Catalina found herself pacing the confines of her room, too wired with adrenaline and concern to even consider rest. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. Slipping quietly out of her room, she made her way through the darkened hallways toward the main part of the house. She told herself she was just looking for information, for confirmation that everyone was truly safe. The truth was, she needed to see Diego with her own eyes. She found him in his office, sitting behind a massive mahogany desk with his head in his hands. His white dress shirt was torn at the shoulder and stained with what looked like blood, though she couldn't tell if it was his or someone else's. The sight of him potentially injured sent panic racing through her system. "Diego," she said softly from the doorway. He looked up sharply, and she saw exhaustion and something deeper in his amber eyes. Something that looked almost like despair. "You should be in your room," he said, but there was no real authority behind the words. "Are you hurt?" Catalina asked, moving closer despite his attempt to dismiss her. "There's blood on your shirt." "It's not mine," Diego replied, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "One of my men was shot in the shoulder. I helped get him to the medical facility." Relief flooded through Catalina so powerfully that her knees actually wobbled. She sank into the chair across from his desk, only then realizing how terrified she'd been that something had happened to him. The intensity of her fear surprised her. When had Diego Morales' safety become so important to her own peace of mind? "Los Serpientes sent 12 men," Diego continued, his voice flat with exhaustion. "Professional mercenaries, not street soldiers. They came to kill, not to intimidate." The words sent a chill down Catalina's spine. This wasn't random violence or posturing. This was war, and she was the reason it had escalated to this level. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "This is my fault. If I hadn't come to you for help." "Stop," Diego said sharply, rising from his chair to move around the desk. "This isn't your fault. You came to me for help with a legitimate problem. What's happening now is the result of choices made by violent men who think they can take what they want through fear and brutality." But he was standing close enough now that Catalina could see the tension lines around his eyes, the way his jaw was clenched with stress and anger. "You're in danger because of me," she said. "Your men are getting shot because you helped my sister." "My men are getting shot because Los Serpientes are trying to muscle into territory that's been mine for 15 years, Diego corrected. "Because they think they can intimidate me into giving up everything I've built." He sat on the edge of his desk, bringing himself closer to her eye level, and Catalina found herself studying his face in the lamplight. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights, and a thin cut along his jawline that must have come from tonight's battle. Without thinking, She reached up to touch the injury, her fingers gentle against his skin. "You could have been killed," she said quietly. Diego went very still under her touch, his breathing deepening as her thumb traced the edge of the cut. "I've been in this business for 20 years, he said, but his voice had gone rough. "It's not the first time someone's tried to kill me." "That doesn't make it better," Catalina replied. "That makes it worse. How many times can you survive something like this before your luck runs out?" Something shifted in Diego's expression at her words. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his cheek, and suddenly the air between them was charged with something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the attraction that had been building since the night they'd met. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked quietly. "Why do you care if my luck runs out?" The honest answer was too dangerous, too revealing. Because somewhere between his kindness with the rescue dogs and his gentleness with Isabella, between his protection of her family and his unexpected vulnerability in quiet moments, she'd started to care about him as more than just her sister's savior. Because when she'd heard that gunfire tonight, her first thought hadn't been for her own safety, but for his. "Because I think I'm falling in love with you," she thought but couldn't say. Instead, she said, "Because you're a good man pretending to be a monster. And good men are rare enough that the world can't afford to lose them." Diego's eyes darkened at her words, his thumb stroking across her knuckles in a gesture that sent heat racing up her arm. "You don't know what I've done," he said quietly. "The things I've had to do to build this life, to protect what's mine. You might not think I'm so good if you knew." "Tell me," Catalina said, surprising them both with her boldness. "Tell me about your sister. Tell me what happened to her." The change in Diego's expression was immediate and devastating. Pain flashed across his features, raw and unguarded, before he tried to pull back behind his usual masks. But Catalina held onto his hand, refusing to let him retreat. "Her name was Sophia," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was 7 years younger than me, the brightest thing in our family. Our father was involved with Los Hermanos, a smaller organization that got absorbed into what became my territory later. Sophia hated the violence, hated what our father's choices meant for our family." Diego's thumb had stopped moving against her hand, and Catalina could feel the tension radiating through his entire body. "When I was 22, I tried to get out. I wanted to take Sophia and disappear, start somewhere new where she could become the teacher she dreamed of being." "What happened?" Catalina asked gently. "Los Hermanos found out about my plans. They decided to teach me a lesson about loyalty, about what happened to people who tried to leave the family business. They took Sophia while I was at work, held her for 3 days while I tore the city apart looking for her." Catalina's heart broke at the pain in Diego's voice, at the guilt and grief that still lived in his eyes after all these years. She squeezed his hand tighter, trying to offer what comfort she could. "When I finally found her, she was already gone," Diego continued. "They'd killed her not because she was a threat, but because they wanted me to know that nothing I loved was safe if I crossed them. She was 19 years old, and she died because I thought I could protect her by leaving." "I'm so sorry," Catalina whispered, and she was. Sorry for his loss. Sorry for the guilt he'd carried all these years. Sorry for the way violence had shaped his life before he'd even had a chance to choose a different path. "After that, I decided that if I was going to live in this world anyway, I was going to be the one in control," Diego said. "I was going to be powerful enough that no one could ever take anything from me again. And for 15 years, that worked. Until you walked into my compound and reminded me what it felt like to have something worth protecting." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Catalina felt her breath catch as she realized what he was saying. That she mattered to him. That despite all his careful control and emotional distance, she'd somehow gotten past his defenses. "Diego," she began, but he was already leaning closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I know this is dangerous," he said quietly. "I know I should send you and Isabella somewhere safe, somewhere far from my world and the violence that comes with it. But I can't. The thought of you leaving, of never seeing you again." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Catalina could see the truth in his eyes, could feel it in the way his thumb brushed across her lower lip with reverent care. "I don't want to leave," she whispered, and realized as she said it that it was absolutely true. Despite the danger, despite the gunfights and the constant threat of violence, she wanted to stay here with him. Diego's control finally snapped. He leaned forward and captured her mouth with his, kissing her with a desperate passion that spoke of weeks of restrained desire finally given permission to burn free. Catalina melted into the kiss, her hands fisting in his torn shirt as she kissed him back with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Diego rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "I know," Catalina replied, and she did. There was no going back now, no pretending that what they felt was just gratitude or temporary attraction. They'd crossed a line that would reshape both their lives. The sound of footsteps in the hallway reminded them that they weren't alone in the compound, that the world beyond this office door was still dangerous and complicated. But as Diego helped her to her feet and walked her back to her room, Catalina knew she'd made her choice. Whatever came next, whatever dangers they'd have to face, she was choosing to face them with Diego Morales. She was choosing love over safety, passion over prudence. She was choosing him. The safe house was a fortified mansion in the mountains outside Guadalajara, complete with its own security team and enough supplies to last for months. Diego had spent the morning making arrangements, coordinating with his most trusted men to ensure Catalina and Isabella would be protected while he dealt with the escalating war with Los Serpientes. It was the logical choice, the smart choice, the choice that would keep the two people who'd become most important to him alive, while he handled business that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with survival in a world built on violence and territorial disputes. So why was he standing in his office, unable to make the phone call that would send them away? "I won't go," Catalina said from the doorway, as if she'd read his thoughts. Diego looked up from the papers scattered across his desk, taking in her determined expression and the way she held herself with newfound confidence. After last night's kiss, something had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained was gone, replaced by an intimacy that made his chest tight with emotions he'd thought he'd buried with Sofia. "You don't understand the situation," Diego said, though he made no move toward the phone. "Los Serpientes are bringing in reinforcements from Sinaloa, professional killers who won't hesitate to target civilians. This compound isn't safe anymore." "Then we'll face it together," Catalina replied, moving closer with each word. "I'm not leaving you to fight this war alone." "This isn't your fight," Diego protested, even as part of him thrilled at her willingness to stay. "You and Isabella could be safe, could start over somewhere new where my enemies can't reach you." Catalina reached his desk and leaned against it, bringing herself within touching distance. Her dark eyes were fierce with determination, and Diego realized she'd grown stronger during her time here. The frightened woman who'd knocked on his door at midnight had transformed into someone who would stand beside him against impossible odds. "You're right," she said quietly. "This war started before I ever met you. But somewhere along the way, it became my fight too. Because I fell in love with you, Diego Morales, and that means your battles are my battles now." The words hit Diego like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and making his heart race in ways that had nothing to do with adrenaline from fighting. He'd hoped, had seen the signs in her touches and kisses, but hearing her say it aloud made everything real in a way that terrified and exhilarated him. "Catalina," he began, but she placed a finger against his lips. "Let me finish," she said. "I know loving you means accepting danger. I know it means living in a world where violence is always possible. But I also know that sending me away won't change how I feel about you. And it won't change the fact that Los Serpientes will keep coming until one of you destroys the other." Diego caught her hand in his, pressing a kiss to her palm before lowering it to rest over his heart. "You could be killed," he said roughly. "If something happened to you because of me, because I was selfish enough to let you stay. If something happened to you while I was hiding in some safe house, I'd never forgive myself," Catalina replied. "I'd rather face danger with you than safety without you." The honesty in her voice, the fierce love shining in her eyes, finally broke through Diego's last defenses. He pulled her around the desk and into his arms, holding her tight against his chest as he breathed in her scent and marveled at the impossible gift of being loved by someone like her. "I love you too," he said against her hair. "More than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. You and Isabella, you've given me something I'd forgotten existed. A family, a reason to come home at night, instead of just surviving another day." Catalina pulled back to look at his face, her hands framing his jaw as tears sparkled in her eyes. "Then don't send us away," she whispered. "Let us stay and fight beside you." Diego knew it was the wrong choice strategically. Knew he was letting emotion override logic in a way that could get them all killed. But looking into Catalina's eyes, feeling the way she fit perfectly in his arms, he found he didn't care about strategy anymore. "All right," he said quietly. "You stay. But we do this my way, with my rules. You don't leave the compound without my permission. You stay armed at all times. And if I tell you to run, you run." "Agreed," Catalina said, then rose on her toes to kiss him with a passion that made his knees weak. The kiss deepened quickly, weeks of restrained desire finally given permission to burn free. Diego's hands tangled in her dark hair as she pressed closer, her soft curves fitting against his hard body in a way that felt like coming home. When she tugged at the buttons of his shirt, he didn't protest. When she whispered his name like a prayer, he was lost. Their first time together was everything Diego had dreamed and nothing like he'd expected. Catalina was shy but eager, responsive to his every touch, generous with her own caresses. She trusted him with her body the way she'd trusted him with her sister's life, completely and without reservation. And when she cried his name in the aftermath, clinging to him like he was her anchor in a storm, Diego knew he'd found something worth dying for. Later, as they lay entwined in his massive bed, Catalina traced patterns on his chest with gentle fingers. "I used to think love was a luxury I couldn't afford," she said quietly. "Between taking care of Isabella and working all the time, I convinced myself I didn't need romance or passion. And now," Diego asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Now I know love isn't a luxury," she replied. "It's the only thing that makes all the rest worthwhile." Before Diego could respond to that profound statement, his phone rang with the sharp insistence that meant emergency. He reached for it reluctantly, not wanting to break the perfect intimacy of the moment. The voice on the other end was Marco, his second-in-command, and the words that came through the speaker made Diego's blood run cold. "Boss, we have a problem. Los Serpientes hit the perimeter on the south side. They're inside the compound." Diego was moving before Marco finished speaking, pulling on clothes with swift efficiency while his mind raced through defensive strategies. "How many men?" he demanded. "At least 20, Marco replied. "Professional assault team. They came through the gardens where the motion sensors have been malfunctioning." Catalina was already dressing, her face pale but determined. Diego caught her arm as she reached for the door. "Stay here," he ordered. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone except me or Marco." But before Catalina could respond, the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a second later, bathing everything in red light that made the familiar room look like a scene from hell. In the distance, Diego could hear gunfire and shouting, the sounds of battle drawing closer to the main house. There in the building, Marco's voice came through the phone, tight with urgency. "Boss, you need to get out of there now." Diego's mind was already calculating escape routes and defensive positions when a new sound made his heart stop. Isabella's scream, high and terrified, came from somewhere in the house. "Isabella," Catalina gasped, starting toward the door. Diego caught her before she could leave the relative safety of his room. "It's a trap," he said urgently. "They want us to come running. They want to separate us." "I don't care," Catalina said fiercely. "She's my sister. I won't hide while they hurt her." The sounds of fighting were getting closer, and Diego realized they were out of time. His defensive plans, his careful security measures, none of it mattered now that Los Serpientes had breached his inner sanctuary. The bedroom door exploded inward under the force of a breaching charge, and armed men in tactical gear poured into the room. Diego moved to shield Catalina, reaching for the weapon he kept in his nightstand, but there were too many of them, and they were too close. The last thing Diego saw before the tranquilizer dart hit his neck was Catalina fighting like a wildcat, refusing to surrender even when the odds were impossible. Then darkness claimed him, and his last coherent thought was a prayer that he'd live long enough to save the woman he loved. When Diego woke hours later, he was alone in his destroyed bedroom, zip-tied to a chair with a note pinned to his chest. "Your territory and your life for the women. You have 24 hours to decide what matters more. Come alone to the warehouse district at midnight tomorrow, or they disappear forever." Looking around at the wreckage of his sanctuary, at the bloodstains that told the story of his men's desperate fight. Diego felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. Los Serpientes had made their final mistake when they'd taken Catalina and Isabella. Now they were going to learn what happened when someone threatened Diego Morales' family. He was going to burn their entire organization to the ground, and he was going to bring his women home, no matter what it cost him. The warehouse district at midnight was a maze of shadows and abandoned buildings, the perfect place for an ambush. Diego crouched behind a shipping container, studying the target building through night vision scopes while his assault team took positions around the perimeter. He'd ignored Los Serpientes' demand to come alone. Some rules of warfare were too stupid to follow, even when the stakes were his own life. Marco's voice crackled through his earpiece. Thermal imaging shows at least 15 hostiles inside, plus 2 smaller heat signatures in the back room. That's got to be the women. Diego's jaw clenched at the confirmation that Catalina and Isabella were inside that death trap of a building. He'd spent the last 18 hours planning this assault, calling in every favor and deploying every resource he'd built over 15 years of careful empire building. Los Serpientes wanted a war. He was about to give them one they'd never forget. Remember, Diego spoke quietly into his comm unit, addressing the 12 men who'd volunteered for what could easily be a suicide mission. The women come out alive. Everything else is secondary. If you have to choose between eliminating a target and protecting them, you protect them. A chorus of quiet affirmatives came back through the radio. These men had served with Diego for years, had seen him build something approaching legitimacy from the violence and chaos of their world. They understood what Catalina and Isabella meant to him, and they'd fight to the death to bring his family home. The assault began with controlled explosions that took out the building's electrical system and created multiple entry points simultaneously. Diego's team moved like ghosts in the darkness, their years of training and experience evident in every calculated step and precisely placed shot. Diego himself went through the main entrance, his rifle cutting down anyone stupid enough to stand between him and the back room where the thermal imaging had located his women. The sounds of battle echoed through the warehouse as his men systematically eliminated Los Serpientes' forces with ruthless efficiency. But when Diego reached the room where Catalina and Isabella were being held, he found it empty except for 2 chairs with cut zip ties on the floor. His heart nearly stopped before he heard Catalina's voice coming from somewhere deeper in the building. "Over here," she called, and Diego followed the sound to find something that made him simultaneously proud and terrified. Catalina had somehow freed herself, and Isabella had found weapons among their captors' supplies, and was currently holding 3 Los Serpientes soldiers at gunpoint, while Isabella cowered behind an overturned table. The men looked genuinely nervous about being held hostage by an angry woman with a loaded pistol, which showed they were smarter than Diego had given them credit for. "I told you I wasn't leaving without a fight," Catalina said when she saw Diego appear in the doorway. She was disheveled and had a cut on her cheek, but her eyes were blazing with the same fierce determination that had brought her to his compound 3 weeks ago. Diego felt a surge of love and admiration so powerful it nearly knocked him off his feet. This woman had not only survived captivity, but had turned the tables on her captors. She'd proven she could handle his world in the most extreme circumstances possible. The cleanup was swift and decisive. Los Serpientes' leadership was eliminated, their remaining forces scattered or captured, and their organization effectively destroyed as a threat to Diego's territory. By dawn, the warehouse district was quiet except for the sound of Diego's men removing evidence and tying up loose ends. But Diego barely noticed the tactical victory. His attention was focused entirely on Catalina and Isabella, on the miracle of having them safe and alive in his arms again. When Catalina had thrown herself into his embrace outside the warehouse, when she'd whispered that she'd known he would come for them, Diego had felt something shift inside his chest. Something that felt like the last pieces of his broken heart finally healing. The ride back to the compound was quiet, everyone too exhausted by the night's events for much conversation. Isabella fell asleep against Catalina's shoulder within minutes, the resilient teenager finally able to rest knowing the nightmare was truly over. But Catalina stayed awake, her hand clasped tightly in Diego's as if she needed the physical connection to believe they'd all survived. "It's over," Diego said quietly as they pulled through the gates of his estate. Los Serpientes is finished. No one will threaten you or Isabella again. Catalina squeezed his hand tighter. What about the next organization that decides they want your territory? She asked. What about the next group that thinks they can intimidate you by targeting the people you love? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the implication that this life would always include dangers, that choosing to love Diego Morales meant accepting a future where violence was always possible. Then we'll face them together, Diego said, bringing her hand to his lips. The way we face this, the way we'll face whatever comes next. 3 months later, the compound had been rebuilt and fortified with security measures that made it virtually impregnable. Diego had used the destruction caused by Los Serpientes as an opportunity to upgrade everything, creating a home that was both sanctuary and fortress, beautiful and safe. Catalina stood in the garden where she'd first begun to fall in love with Diego, watching him teach Isabella proper shooting technique at the newly constructed firing range. Her sister had insisted on learning to defend herself after the kidnapping, and Diego had been surprisingly patient and thorough in his instruction. Isabella was proving to be a natural marksman, something that both impressed and slightly worried Catalina. You know she's going to be more dangerous than either of us if she keeps improving like this, Marco observed, joining Catalina on the garden path. The man who served as Diego's second-in-command had become something like a protective uncle to both sisters over the past months. She certainly got the Herrera stubborn streak, Catalina replied with a smile. Once she decides she wants something, there's no stopping her. Speaking of stubborn Herrera women, Marco said with a meaningful glance toward the house. El Jeef has been acting strange all week. Nervous. Keep catching him staring off into space with this weird look on his face. Before Catalina could ask what Marco meant by that observation, Diego himself appeared on the path, looking uncharacteristically uncertain for a man who commanded an empire with absolute authority. Walk with me, he asked, offering his arm with the old-fashioned courtesy that had become one of her favorite things about him. They strolled through the gardens in comfortable silence, past the fountains and flowering trees that had become as familiar to Catalina as her childhood home had once been. This place was her sanctuary now, the compound where she'd found not just safety but love, purpose, and a family larger than she'd ever imagined possible. I've been thinking about our conversation that first night, Diego said suddenly, stopping beside the rose garden where Isabella often helped him tend the plants. When you said you'd give me anything for my help with your sister. Catalina felt her cheeks warm at the memory. I was desperate, she said. I would have promised you anything to save Isabella. I know, Diego replied, but I've been wondering what you'd say if I asked for something now. Not from desperation, but from choice. He was nervous, Catalina realized with surprise. Diego Morales, who faced down rival cartels and government officials with equal calm, was actually nervous about whatever he wanted to ask her. What would you want? She asked gently, encouraging him to continue. Diego stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his amber eyes serious and intent. I'd want forever, he said quietly. I'd want your name legally tied to mine. I'd want the right to call you my wife in front of the whole world. Catalina's breath caught in her throat as Diego dropped to one knee right there in the garden, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. The ring inside was breathtaking, a classic solitaire diamond that caught the afternoon sunlight and threw rainbows across the rose petals. Catalina Herrera, Diego said, his voice rough with emotion. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life protecting you and Isabella and making you happy? Will you help me build something beautiful out of this dangerous world we live in? Have you ever experienced a moment where your entire future crystallized in front of you, where you could see exactly what your life could become if you were brave enough to reach for it? Because that's what Catalina felt looking down at Diego's hopeful face, seeing the love and vulnerability in his expression as he waited for her answer. Yes, she said, laughing through the tears that sprang to her eyes. Yes, of course, yes. The ring slid onto her finger like it had been made for her, and when Diego stood to kiss her with passionate relief, Catalina felt the last pieces of her carefully constructed independence dissolve into something much better. Partnership. Unity. A love strong enough to face anything the world might throw at them. The engagement party 2 weeks later was a revelation in how thoroughly Catalina and Isabella had been integrated into Diego's extended family. His men and their wives treated the sisters like blood relatives, with Marco giving an embarrassingly heartfelt speech about how love had transformed their fearsome leader into someone who smiled on a regular basis. Even Maria, the compound's head of household, dabbed at her eyes when Diego announced that the wedding would take place in 6 months, giving them time to plan something worthy of his bride. "I never thought I'd see the day," Maria confessed to Catalina later while they were cleaning up from the celebration. "20 years I've worked for that man, watched him build walls around his heart higher than the ones around this compound. But you and Isabella, you broke right through them like they were made of paper." As autumn turned to winter and wedding plans consumed their days, Catalina found herself settling into Diego's world with surprising ease. She took over management of his legitimate business interests, proving to have an unexpected talent for organization and strategic thinking. Isabella threw herself into her final year of high school, while also learning advanced security techniques from Diego's men, preparing for the unique challenges of being family to one of Mexico's most powerful men. The wedding itself was a perfect blend of elegance and practicality, held in the compound's gardens under layers of security that made it simultaneously the most romantic and most protected ceremony in Guadalajara's recent history. Isabella served as maid of honor, radiant in rose-colored silk and beaming with joy at seeing her sister so deeply loved. Marco walked Catalina down the aisle, having earned the honor through months of loyal protection and genuine affection. But it was Diego's face when he saw her in her wedding dress that made all the danger and difficulty of their unconventional courtship worthwhile. He looked at her like she was a miracle, like he couldn't quite believe she was real and choosing to bind her life to his. Their first dance as husband and wife was to a song Isabella had picked, something about love conquering fear and finding home in another person's arms. As Diego held her close and whispered promises in her ear about their future together, Catalina marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From that desperate midnight knock on a stranger's door to this moment of perfect happiness, it had been a path filled with danger and uncertainty. But looking around at their gathered family, at Isabella laughing with Marco's teenage daughter, at the life they'd built together from the ruins of their separate tragedies, Catalina knew she wouldn't change a single moment. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with the most desperate choices. Sometimes knocking on the devil's door at midnight led not to damnation, but to salvation. As Diego spun her around the dance floor while their family cheered, Catalina Morales smiled and held tight to the man who'd proven that even in the darkest corners of the world, love could still light the way home.